Chapter 19, December Fire from JE2US-A Novel. Jesus stepped up to the podium with a pocket full of story. He had passed Suzy on the way up. He gently placed his hand on the back of her neck and pulled her into a hug. She put her head against his chest and held on for what seemed like an excessively long time. Finally, he turned to face the neon crowd. They were all waiting to hear how he might respond to this most serious of Suzy's sermons. He saw the red light on the TV camera in the back corner. 200 faces all turned to hear his heart. This is the story of a man who lost hope, whose life had holes. He pulled the sheets from his back pocket, smoothed them out, and began to read. My fire went out in October. It's not that I ran out of wood or paper. It's more like I ran out of, fire. I still had everything I needed to make a fire, all the ingredients, but something was missing. The something that makes heat, warmth. I couldn't find it and didn't even know where to look for it. When I think about it now, my fires had never been much to brag about. It's not that they didn't look firish, but they always had a showroom quality to them, more pizzazz than essence. They had sparkle to burn, but no blaze to warm. They cast shadows, but couldn't throw heat. At first, I was okay without heat, as long as the fire burned big and bright. If the fire was flashy enough, I could almost talk myself into feeling the warmth. But gradually, even the imagined heat escaped up the chimney. That's when the cold became real, when the chill entered my home. One day I sat down in front of my fire and saw it for what it was. Anemic strands of pale, passionless flame. I hardly recognized it. It seemed artificial, hollow, and I was cold. For the next month, I did everything in my power to coax my hearth to life. I went through boxes of matches, stacks of papers. I created sparks without fire, flames without heat. I tried burning a lot of different things that made some pretty hot claims, but they all left me cold. In the evening, I would go for long walks. Long walks. I'm not sure if it was even an attempt to close my eyes to the predicament or if I just wanted to see what other people's houses looked like. Houses that harbored real fires. My favorite walk took me by the Wellington mansion. It was the original house in Bakersville, the oldest house, the centerpiece of our little town. It was over a mile from my house, but worth every step. The place glowed, practically radiated heat. Mr. Wellington had fire, lots of it. I think I counted 12 chimneys, and there were fires in at least half of them at all times. I remember walking by there for weeks, slowing as I went by, watching the smoke curl from the chimney tops. I walked downwind so I could smell it. I climbed the drifted snowbank so I could look in and see the firelight flickering against the walls. It was a study in light. I imagined the warmth on my skin, my face. Every day I fought the urge to approach the front door, ring the bell, and invite myself in. I had heard that Mr. Wellington was a kindly old gentleman, generous with strangers, but I'd never met him personally. I couldn't just waltz up to his door and expect him to drop everything and give me a tour. It seemed so presumptuous. So I walked on by again. One night, I told myself, I'll just walk up to the door. I wouldn't ring the bell. I'd just get close. I climbed the last 4 stairs, hands in my pockets, trying to look casual, inconspicuous. There was a big welcome mat in front of the door and an engraved bronze plaque attached to the wall that said, "Make yourself at home." Maybe it was the plaque, maybe it was the wind, but I involuntarily reached for the bell. I felt the button go in as I pushed it. I actually thought about running, but I had crossed the invisible line and now I had to stay. I hurriedly stumbled through a mental rehearsal for why I was ringing the bell. The explanation seemed so clumsy in my mind, I dreaded hearing it trip out of my mouth. When no one answered, I was almost relieved. I noticed the inner door was slightly ajar, an inch or so. Another freak inoculation of bravery punctured my right arm. I knocked on the door, surprisingly hard. Still nothing. Feeling very cold and having spent so much courage just getting to this point, I pulled the storm door open a foot and yelled through the opening, "Hello? Anybody home?" No response. All I could hear was the crackling of the fire in the next room. I stepped just inside the door, wondering where this dose of courage had come from. "Excuse me, I was just wondering if, would it be all right with you if I just came in and stood by your fire? Just for a minute or so." Still nothing. "Anyone?" I started to feel ill at ease and turned to leave. Just then, a loud snap from the fire reminded me of my chill. I turned back and looked around the foyer. A beautiful chandelier hung above me with 1,000 glowing crystalline pendants. A wide, arcing staircase of maple and cherry lay straight ahead of me. It ascended counterclockwise to a balcony lined with heavily framed landscape paintings. The walls were a mix of mahogany trim and deep burgundy paint. The fire snapped again. I made a mental calculation. If I took 2 considerable steps straight ahead, I should be able to look into the living room and see the fire. Why not, I thought. I'm this far in. I took those 2 giant steps and turned to face the room. I felt the warm glow on my face before I had even finished the turn. The fire captured me. There was an instantaneous feeling of connection with something that had been missing, absent, lost. I felt a surge of emotion. At first, I thought it was fear, but I knew it was more than just that. Not sure how to handle this avalanche of feelings, I turned and ran out the door. I was still warm when I arrived home that night. I made a cup of hot tea and sat down in my big soft chair in the living room. I tried to picture what else had been in that room with the fire, but I realized I hadn't even looked at anything else. I had a vivid mental picture of the entryway, but the living room, nothing. The fire had so consumed me that its presence was my only memory. As I sat in my chair, reliving the evening, something caught my attention. I thought I smelled something. Smoke. I jumped up and started checking around the house. Was something burning? I looked everywhere, upstairs and down. Nothing. I came back to the living room. There it was again, a faint smell of smoke. I finally figured it had to be coming from one of the neighbors' houses and let it go at that. I closed my eyes, picturing Mr. Wellington's fire, and fell fast asleep. The next night I walked again. There were chunky snowflakes falling through the evergreens in front of the Wellington mansion. The light sifted through the windows and danced on the floating white crystals. The warm pull was irresistible. Without hesitation, I walked up to the door and rang the bell. Again, there was no answer. I rang twice and waited. I noticed the stately wooden door was even further ajar tonight. It was practically swung open. Something else was new. There, stuck to the bronze plaque, was a handwritten note. In graceful penmanship, it simply said, "Please, come on in. Make yourself completely at home." So, he had seen me last night? I wonder why he hadn't come down, said hi. Had he been watching me the whole time? I stepped inside the door. "Hello, Mr. Wellington." I kicked the snow off my shoes as I waited for a response. "You have a beautiful place here." I took another step in. "Would you mind terribly if I just warmed myself by your fire for a minute or two again? I won't be long." The only sound was the crackling of the fire. I followed it into the living room. It was everything I had remembered. Every inch of the hearth flashed with flames. Several good-sized logs lay on a gleaming bed of coals. The logs looked like they had been freshly laid on the fire. Had Mr. Wellington seen me coming? Had he refreshed the fire just for me? I walked closer to the fire this time. Halfway across the living room, the warmth saturated me immediately. I felt a droplet of water land on my nose as the fire melted the snow on my hair. I reached my hands toward the fire, receiving its warmth, pulling it toward me. My muscles relaxed, my breathing slowed. The heat almost seemed to be erasing the months I'd spent without fire. The flames touched me in a healing way in places I never knew needed healing. I remember thinking, who was Mr. Wellington? What kind of man invites a perfect stranger into his home? The kind of man who knows how to make a fire, that's who, I thought. As I left that night, I yelled from the entryway, "Thanks, Mr. Wellington. Thanks for sharing your fire." As soon as I opened the front door of my house, I knew something was different. The smell of smoke was much stronger than it had been last night. I put my sleeve up to my nose, thinking maybe it was just my clothes that had taken on the smell from Mr. Wellington's fire, but I knew that wasn't it. As I rounded the kitchen and headed for the living room, I saw the glow. The room was bathed in a faint amber tint, subtle but certain. I stopped at the edge of the room and peeked around the corner toward the fireplace. I couldn't believe what I saw. It was beautiful. There was no fire, but the hearth was covered with embers, a bed of red hot coals. The room had a warmth it hadn't enjoyed for months. My home was coming back to life. It didn't make any sense, this rekindling, but yet it seemed completely natural. I couldn't explain it, but it almost felt like I didn't need to. Back in November, I had ignited all kinds of things on my own and never produced a heat I could feel. This new beginning felt real. I didn't question this discovery. I was enjoying it too much to question it. The next evening, I was even more eager to pay my nightly visit to the mansion. Things were turning around for me, and in large part, it seemed due to my new acquaintance with Mr. Wellington and his fire. This night, as I skipped up the walk, I noticed another note hanging on the door. It said, "I enjoyed your visit last night. Please feel free to stay as long as you like, till you're warm. Try out my chair. I moved it in front of the fire just for you." I did. This was the closest I had been to the fire yet. The chair had been pulled around squarely in front of the hearth. I fell into it and was surprised how it fit me, like it was my chair, custom built for me. I took my shoes off and stretched my legs toward the fire. I was sitting in a stranger's house, and yet I was completely comfortable, completely at home. It felt so right. I stared into the fire for hours that night, mesmerized by the blue, red, and yellow flames. They seemed to talk to me. They told me of where I'd been and where I was going. They showed me who I was and who I could be. I saw ashes of failure fall and sparks of hope rise. The chimney carried the sparks heavenward and sprinkled them across the sky. I had a sense that I had been freed, lifted and released by the fire. The darkness lifted, the chill released. I snuggled down into the leather chair and fell asleep under a peaceful blanket of warmth. The sun was just beginning to flirt with the horizon when I woke up. I'd been there all night. I was toasty, my cheeks rosy red. I sprang from the chair with an excitement I hadn't had in, well, ever. I threw on my shoes and ran out the door. Halfway down the walk, I skidded to a stop, wheeled, and ran back inside. With a lilt in my voice, I said, "I still haven't stayed as long as I'd like, but I'm getting there. Thanks, Mr. Wellington. See you tonight." As I started jogging toward home, my mind jumped from his fireplace to mine. Would my coals be even brighter, hotter? I notched it up a few miles per hour. As I ran down the middle of the road, skipping over the long shadows of dawn, I felt the steam coming off my heat-saturated body. Would the glow still be there? Anticipation coaxed me into a full-out sprint. Did I dare to wish for fire? I practically flew around the last corner, squinting down to the end of the block. I pulled up abruptly and stood, staring in the middle of the street. Through the steamy mist of my own frozen breath, I gazed toward my house. My eyes passed over it the first time, thinking they had focused on the wrong 3-bedroom English Tudor. My eyes shifted back one lot. My knees gave a quiver as I realized it was my house that was aglow. It was my windows that were ablaze. It was my chimney that was puffing like an industrial smokestack. I did the last 110 flat. I threw the door open and skittered across the hardwood floor, sliding the last few steps into the living room. Before I could even look, the snap crackling told the story. It was an inferno, the biggest fire my hearth had ever seen, not just sparkle and flash, but sizzle and fizz. It was throwing strikes of pure heat. It was real. The fire was real. The snap was familiar, the warmth reminiscent of a fire I had come to know. Mr. Wellington's fire had come home, to my home. I spent the day in a dreamland. I knew this dream was reality, but reality had never felt this good. I had never spent an entire day barefoot and warm in winter, dancing around in a t-shirt. I ate frozen yogurt and drank iced tea. My house was so hot, I even left my front door cracked open. I had heat to spare. At about 7 o'clock that night, I grabbed my coat and gloves and headed for the front door. Even though I had my own fire now, I was still drawn to Mr. Wellington's. Maybe even more so because I had my own fire. It's hard to explain. As I pushed the front door open, I ran headfirst into a woman standing on my steps. I grabbed at her arm just in time to keep her from falling off the steps into my shrubs. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. I didn't see you there. Are you okay?" She was even more startled than me, flustered and confused and embarrassed. "You must think I'm a snoop. I'm not, really. I'm just..." "No, that's okay. You just startled me," I said, trying to downplay the whole situation. Whoever this woman was, we were getting off to an awkward start. Finally, I looked at her, in her eyes. She was a young woman with eyes that looked sad. She was looking down at her feet when she decided to speak. I'm really sorry, but I was just, well, I'll come back later. You're leaving, so I'll just come back." She trailed off as she turned to leave. "No," I said, "I'm in no huge rush. What can I do for you, Miss Suzy?" "I live 2 doors down, right over there," she pointed. "Hi, Suzy. I thought you looked familiar." Then I added, "You look cold. How long have you been out here?" She paused. "A while." It seemed like she was trying to figure out what to say. She finally found some momentum. "You'll probably think I'm nuts, but I've been looking at your house all day. Your windows, they're glowing. I noticed your chimney. It's busy." We both smiled. Well, you've obviously got a fire in there, and, well, my fire went out a while back, and I was just wondering if I could Come in and stand by my fire? I finished her question for her. She looked like she was caught between a smile and tears. I grabbed her hand and started pulling her into my house, then stopped. Wait a minute, I said. I've got an even better idea. Want to see the best, most beautiful fire in the world? I didn't wait for her answer. I just started tugging her down the street. As she bounced along beside me, I told her my story, which I suspected would soon be her story. Just hearing about this fire was bringing a little color back to her cheeks. I wondered if she had any idea how this fire would change her life. Well, that's how I found fire. For real. Good story, huh? If you're ever in Bakersville, make sure you visit the Wellington mansion. You really need to experience it. This fire. Anyhow, I haven't figured it all out yet. But one thing I do know. I was cold, but now I'm warm. It's December, and I've got a new fire burning in my home.